You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Tuesday, August 6th, 2019, and it is also the feast day of the Transfiguration. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are exploring our mission statement here, which is letting the Eucharist lead. Yesterday, we envisioned ourselves as part of a great Eucharistic procession that will be our way of life. Today, we are going to talk about the first and the most common way that we encounter the Eucharist, which is through the sacrifice of the Mass. But before we get there, I want to introduce you to someone. Now, there is a man named Cardinal Van Thuan. He lives in Vietnam, and he is quite a bit older than you. In fact, Cardinal Van Thuan spent 13 of his years of his life in prison. During the 1970s, there was a war in Vietnam, and a certain group of people called the Communists took over, and they despised religion. They especially hated the Catholic Church. So Cardinal Van Thuan, as a leader of the Catholic Church, was imprisoned for 13 years. And listen, for 9 full years, he was in solitary confinement. That simply means that he was locked in a tiny room all by himself. He only had contact with 2 guards during that whole time. So think about that. Think about how old you are and how long 9 years is. Now, the reason I talk about Cardinal Van Thuan, or we'll talk about him as Cardinal Francis today, is because of the Eucharist. Now, while he was in jail, he sent message to people on the outside for some essential supplies that he needed. And they sent him a little bit of wine and some Eucharistic bread concealed in a flashlight. For the 9 years that he was in prison, all by himself, Cardinal Van Thuan was able to practice or to say Mass every single day. He simply would put a couple drops of wine in the palm of his hand and mix it with water, just as the priest does at Mass. He also took a tiny bit of the host that had been smuggled into him inside of a flashlight. And through that, even though he wasn't in a church, even though he was all alone, even though he didn't have any fancy gold chalice or altar, he, because he was a priest, was able to say Mass. And through that, Jesus, in the Eucharist, was truly present in that tiny, quiet, lonely jail cell. He was there. Now, this is particularly important to talk about today because today is the Feast of the Transfiguration. You might know that on the Transfiguration, Jesus took a few of his closest disciples to the top of a mountain. And while they were there, Jesus was lifted up into the air, and he was utterly transformed. He glowed like the sun, like he was the source of light itself. And not only that, some pretty important people from the Old Testament appeared and were talking with Jesus. Moses and Elijah. These are 2 of the most important people from the Old Testament, and they had been dead a long time. So through the Transfiguration, a couple of Jesus's apostles were able to see that Jesus really, really is God. Don't doubt it. It's true. Now, the Transfiguration is similar to what we experience in Mass, only it might not seem quite as spectacular to us. But let me tell you, it's even more spectacular. Just as Cardinal Van Thuan was able to take a couple drops of wine and a little bit of bread, and through the sacrifice of the Mass, God transformed it into Jesus truly present. So we experience at Mass every day we make the effort to go. Jesus is truly there. Jesus desires to be with us always, and not just in a figurative way, but in a real way, in a way that is just as real as the fact that you might be with your mom right now or in your classroom and people are there that you can see. In the Eucharist, Jesus is with us in just as real a way. Therefore, Cardinal Van Thwane said that even though the 9 years of solitary confinement in prison were horrible, he always had the companionship of Jesus Christ truly present in the Eucharist. And so, Sprouts, my challenge for you today is about the Eucharist. I would like you simply, the next time that you are in church, whether it's tomorrow or Sunday, I want you to challenge yourself to look closely and look directly at that host as the priest elevates it. Think in your mind, this truly is Jesus, as real as if he was here in the flesh talking to me. This really is Jesus.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be.
Just one more thing. I would like to formally welcome you to Season 2 of the Catholic Sprouts podcast. This year, we are going to be offering an opportunity to go even deeper with the content that we share here. We have started a Patreon community, and for just $4 a month or $1 a week, you can have access to a printable activity to do in your family or classroom that will explore even deeper what we're talking about on the podcast. Along with this, we will also be compiling a simple sheet for parents so that they can explore similar content, look at adult topics on this content, and also form simple but beautiful communities in real life to discuss these things and really bond together as we work together to grow the saints of tomorrow. For more details on the Patreon community, I invite you to explore the show notes for this episode.